Adventures in Supply Chain Podcast is pleased to present this video episode of the Coronavirus and Supply Chain series with Rajiv Gupta, procurement nerd and lifelong learner in procurement, supply chain, finance, and all things digital. Rajiv Gupta is the founder of Procurement League, a technology platform for professionals of all levels in procurement and supply chain practice to connect, exchange knowledge, learn, and grow. His experience includes sourcing and procurement leadership roles with focus on source to pay at Infosys, Ariba, Zycus, and Whirlpool, among others. In this episode, we talked about source to pay. How is that different from procure to pay? When is a good moment for an organization to start looking at source to pay? How do you build a business case? What technologies are available? What are the critical aspects to look at? Where do you start with a source to pay implementation? What are the critical factors for success and how finance, procurement, and IT can work together? This episode is sponsored by USM Supply Chain. USM stands for Unstoppable, Scalable, Mindful Supply Chain. Check us out at usmsupplychain.com to scale up your profits together with your supply chain. And now with you, your host, Marcia, and her amazing guest, Rajiv Gupta.
Good afternoon, Rajiv. A pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
I am very, very pleased to be on the show with you today.
And today we are going to talk about a great topic. It's one of my favorite topics. But let's start with your organization, your role, and also what you have been doing in your
Sure,
career.
absolutely. So, since graduating, I have worked in procurement and with the procurement executives, both on the buy side as well as on the sell side. Even when on the service provider side, I have been in the functional consulting and solution design roles. And this has allowed me and provided a fantastic opportunity to be the earliest adopter of significant tech and organizational mileposts in the procurement function maturity. For example, I used to train users in e-sourcing and e-selling in its early stages during the early 2000s. I educated users and created solutions for AI applications in procurement back in 2004 when AI was not so common. And then again, I was very fortunate to be designing solutions for procurement outsourcing when it was not such a big industry. So with the experience, I have set out to create new business models and solutions to enable procurement teams to make an orbital shift into simplifying, leveraging network economy in creating an entirely new set of capabilities as a function. It has driven me to create two businesses. One is Procurement League, which is a software-powered learning, sharing, and developmental platform for procurement teams. And another is Right Sourcing Solutions, which is an agile, practitioners-driven, pragmatic procurement services organization.
Wow, that's very impressive. That's very impressive. And the topic is related exactly to that. We want to know more about source to pay process and what is the difference with procure to pay, because sometimes we hear them and maybe we use them interchangeably, but I'm not so sure that is the correct way.
Yeah. It's a great question, and I'm going to give you certain answers today, which may not be very run of the mill, but they are basically, what I think is a very different take at the same problems of procure to pay or source to pay. So in very simplistic terms, procure to pay essentially is what you would call supplier and price discovery. And it enables the flow of services from suppliers to consumers, as well as the flow of money from consumers to suppliers for the consumed services or goods.
Yes.
On the other hand, source to pay is all about value discovery and actually enabling a pipeline of value identification, capturing the value and realizing the value at the front end of procure to pay. Unfortunately, source to pay is generally made out to be all of a technology problem, when actually the equation is source to pay is equal to value plus procure to pay. Now, this is my equation. Doesn't mean this is everybody in the industry says that, but this is my take to the problem, that actually source to pay is value plus procure to pay. For example, I mean, I'll just give you a quick example. Like, if you are trying to negotiate a cloud agreement with Amazon Web Services, AWS, imagine what is the buying or the negotiating leverage that you really have with AWS. Very, very little. However, some very savvy sourcing ninjas can actually get 20 to 30% more value out of the AWS contracts by being very value focused, looking at everything but the price and supplier aspects. Going back to our equation, it's basically looking at everything but procure to pay. So it's just, it's basically looking at and focusing at the value. Another example that I would like to give you is, kind of a travel. Now, although we know now due to pandemic, not people are not traveling a lot, so there's not much of a travel to spend in general. But, if you were to really look at travel as a spend earlier, you would look at, okay, how can I really optimize my airfare? How can I really optimize my sectors? How can I optimize, in terms of economy fares or, the least fare that is possible and things like that, right? So a lot of the spend analysis and trying to kind of analyze and then trying to optimize maybe some discounts with the airlines. All of that is a very complex process. All of it is what I call a procure to pay approach. But a source to pay approach actually could be when you really step back and you see that, okay, in my organization, from all the departments, who all is really traveling, who all is traveling around the same dates. Is it like a big conference going on and there are 10 different departments and 2 people from each departments are going for that conference? Is it really required? How can I really plan the travel of the teams? How is it really linked to the projects, right? It may be so happening that, and I have lived this life myself. I would realize I would land in a particular city for a project and I will realize that there are 5 more of my colleagues who are coming from all over the world. Perhaps we did not need 5 of those colleagues. We only needed 2 of those colleagues. I'm sure this is a situation that most of us come across. So that's what I call it, value focused, approach. And if we really focus on value, that's what becomes source to pay, because then we step back and we start asking the question that, do we really even need this travel? Do we need all these people to travel? Can we really optimize that? And if we did that, that would lead to 10 to 20, 30% reduction in their spend, then really trying to get 2%, savings on the fares or things like that. So that's what I really call it source to pay, which is basically, really focusing on value, not really as much on the transaction between the supplier as well as the consumer and the flow of services and goods and money.
Yes, I see. So it's like source to pay would be like more like the strategic piece together with the procure to pay that is more like the tactical to execute, right?
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
Great. And when do you think companies need to start looking at this process? Do they need to get to a certain size? Or what the issues they can see that they say, okay, this is the moment that we need to take action on the source to pay process?
That's again an interesting thought. And like I had promised to you that, you would not hear from me the traditional talk and the answers, right? I think the answer to this question is actually any day. So, there is no such huge trigger that you really need, or a specific day in terms of starting to look at source to pay. Let me explain that. Essentially, if one wants to be empathetic to their internal users, you should start looking at source to pay. That's what really source to pay is. It basically is expressing and actually exercising empathy towards your internal customers or your users. Because guess what? Like I explained in the equation, which is, again, equation that I have created for myself, which is source to pay is equal to value plus procure to pay. If we want to really go after the value, it cannot really happen in isolation. And I think, you would find this argument a lot in your conversations that procurement is always struggling to really kind of, find a seat at the table, work with the stakeholders and things like that, right? But if you really simplify that, what it really requires is that, especially in the indirect spend, who are the budget holders? The budget holders are actually our business and users themselves. They really hold the budget. Procurement doesn't have the budget for
No.
indirect spend. These are the functions which decide that, okay, I'm going to spend, so many $100,000 in travel. I'm going to spend, a couple $100,000 in office supplies. I'm going to spend a couple $1 million in consulting services. I'm going to spend, a couple $1 million in this. So, they hold the budget for all the categories, each of these departments or the units internally. And if we really want to discover and realize more value, we have to integrate ourselves with these users very, very tightly. And that is what essentially is empathy. So the starting point becomes the empathy and design thinking. So coming back, source to pay has more value than short-term KPIs of savings and compliance, etc. And it generally is a good business practice. So, since it is a good business practice, you can go after source to pay any day, and you do not really have to wait for a significant external trigger or an event that sets in motion your evaluation of, you need to now implement source to pay. It's just, if you bring that kind of an empathy into your working, you are then actually trying to discover and go after value on a daily basis. And that's what really source to pay is, to, as per me.
Yes, and you're exactly right, because it's to help our stakeholders.
Exactly.
That is the moment when they need to buy.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
they give, of course, they give high priority to that. Yes. And so based on that it can be on any day, do organizations need to have an ERP system before going into this step? Because traditionally we have like an implementation, an ERP implementation, and then when we get to a certain size, the organization gets to a certain level, then they look at procure to pay. But that's the case. Now I don't, because I have seen now there are applications only for procure to pay. It's different. There has been a change over the years.
So I go back to the basics as usual, in my way of really looking at things, because, one of the things that I have tried to practice, learn, and improve on consistently is, we have to really step back, detach ourselves emotionally from any problem statement in order to really look at, these simplistic solutions to any problem. So, when, to your question, when I look at your question, I would step back and say that, look, what is really an ERP? And ERP is essentially an enterprise resource planning software, application, platform, whatever you want to call it, right? And what are the most valuable resources for an enterprise? I mean, they essentially are people, money, and time. Those are the resources. So what essentially, through an ERP you're trying to do is to manage those three. I mean, there could be more, but these are the three most critical resources that an enterprise has at its disposal. It's people, money, and time, and you want to manage them most efficiently. And that's what, ERP really does, or helps you do that. Now my approach is, you can do that, as long as you can effectively and efficiently manage these resources, even with something as simple as a Microsoft Excel, you can still use a source to pay system, right? But, let's be real, let's be practical, right? For large enterprises, and we know that, companies and enterprises are living and breathing entities. They are constantly changing. People are joining, people are leaving. New businesses are being created, businesses are being shut down, mergers, acquisitions. And so these are living and breathing entities, changing shape, size every day. I mean, in that sense. So managing these resources, which is, your people, time and money, for these companies via Excel can actually be highly error prone, and, it could be very inefficient. So hence an ERP backbone is always beneficial for a source to pay system to bolt onto. So that's kind of, my perspective, that look, while in all reality, it's not the essential requirement, but having an ERP that exists and you can have a source to pay system that can really bolt on to that. Because guess what? Again, the equation of source to pay is equal to value plus procure to pay, and you can do a lot of your procure to pay and integrate it with ERP. It's always helpful.
Yes, great, perfect. And when we are going through this, right, and we need to select, what are the options available and what element should we be paying attention?
So, in terms of technologies or options available, there are many,
Yes.
right? There are just, we are now living in a time that I have not experienced before, that, we have so much choice, right? And having so much choice also sometimes is not the good thing.
It becomes a challenge.
It becomes a challenge, right? So, there's just so much choice available, which is good, which is a good thing in general for the industry. But, we have so much more to choose from, but, without really getting into the sci-fi kind of, stuff that typically gets thrown at us, such as, AI, ML, all these buzzwords that are being always pushed by the service providers. I would personally look at any functionality, feature, or a solution that does this system make it easier for me to discover value. Does it make it easier for me to capture the value? Does it make it easier for me to realize this value? And in this value equation, again, we've got people, we've got our users, we've got our internal customers and our team members who play a very, very central role. And hence the, overemphasis on the technology as a medium to simplify, not to complicate. So as long as, I'm able to get this sense that by choosing this technology or this set of options available, I can simplify my day-to-day business, my day-to-day work. I think, that becomes a critical, emphasis. Yes, there are a lot of technical evaluation, criteria, and there is a method and a science to evaluate source to pay solutions, but that by itself is a huge, huge conversations. And actually, we are going to very soon do a class on that by an ex-CPO of a global insurance company, where we're going to cover some of this in very detailed terms, that what are the features, how do you really evaluate source to pay solutions, from the plethora of options that are available to you.
Great, great. And so when we start, let's pretend that we select a solution. So where do we start with this implementation, and how can the different functions work together? Because here we are talking about procurement, finance, IT, and also who takes the lead, because someone needs to be the process owner there, right?
That is correct. That's a very interesting problem to look at. And, it's funny that when you look at in isolation, each of these functions, which is finance or IT or even other functions like risk and legal and others, everyone has certain expectations, certain KPIs when it comes to the process, when it comes to the data, when it comes to reporting for a source to pay system, right? Everyone has its own KPIs that they want to kind of, focus on. But guess what? If we again, remove ourselves a little bit from the problem pipeline, because, everyone has its own utility of that pipeline. Everyone has, like, any shower, you can just turn the knob and, you can get a jet spray or you can get a rain shower or whatnot, right? So everyone has its own kind of utility of the system. But the data, the water that is running through the pipeline is the same, right? Yeah. So if that is essentially the problem, that the entity is the same, then why, why do we really come into this, why do we come across this problem that, we run into these issues that these functions cannot really work together. And it always amazes me, believe me, for so many years, I couldn't really get my head around that, when the data running through the pipeline, when the entities that we are interacting are the same, why do we have this friction? And I think, justifiably so, perhaps there are some reasons that, we struggle with having these, functions work together. One of the ways to look at is that I always look at it and I explain it to the people is that, look, whatever happens, if you look at really, the procurement and payment or finance, whatever happens or what you see in finance when it comes to procure to pay is essentially an outcome of something that finance is not doing, but actually happening upstream in the process. For example, if the timely payment to vendor metrics is failing, or finance is not able to pay the vendor in time, it is rarely because of the AP clerk not having entered the invoice or not having received the invoice. It's not his problem. He's not able to enter the invoice because maybe he's not able to find the supplier. Guess what? Why? Because perhaps sourcing had to work with contracting, and there was a legal workflow that the supplier had to go through legal reviews, and the supplier had to be entered by somebody else. And before that only, you basically issued a contract or a PO or just called your supplier and started getting the services. Now supplier has submitted the invoice, but you just can't find the supplier in the system. So essentially, finance is getting affected because of the things that they did not control. And I think this is the reason. So we have to really step back and ask for each and every function involved that, okay, what's in it for them? And then define that and relate that to their KPIs and the interrelationships, and then work through that problem.
Yes, and I have experienced that when we cannot work together or we cannot work together well. But you are right, all of us are including data that then we are going to use for our reporting, for our KPIs. And that I have a follow-up question. What are the key KPIs in this? Something that we can consider, the metrics that we can consider and say this implementation has been successful, or we are improving our procure to pay, or in the case that we are adding more value, source to pay process?
There are a lot of KPIs that you can really use to evaluate the progress or the success of a source to pay implementation program, right? My general recommendation about KPIs is to keep it to the bare minimum.
Yes.
I think if you have more than 3 or 5 metrics, perhaps it is just too much. So I think that's one very important aspect when it comes to metrics. The second thing about the KPIs selection to me is, think about the KPIs as not resulting in a watermelon effect. And let me explain that. So what happens is that, let's say I'm procurement, right?
Yes.
I'm just worried about my KPIs. And the watermelon effect is essentially, all of my KPIs look good. So they are all green from outside. So all my SLAs and KPIs look green on the chart. So I have done my job. But essentially, if you cut the watermelon and you see inside, you see a lot of other data or KPIs essentially red, basically meaning that, look, although I may have done my job, I may have ended up impacting someone else's KPI, whether it is legal, whether it is contracting, whether it is finance or things like that. So when you are looking at a source to pay system and a set of KPIs, you have to really look at the end-to-end KPIs, ensuring that there is no watermelon effect. It should not be green for me, but red for you, right? It should be green for everyone. So that's kind of, my recommendation when it comes to KPIs. in terms of the real KPIs or actual KPIs that recommended are, I think it's also a function of the key drivers to an implementation and where the maturity of an organization is. For example, the kind of situation that we are in a pandemic situation, there are certain businesses which are facing a huge set off of the revenue or the demand from their end consumers. So their KPIs could be very different than the KPIs of hospital systems, which are experiencing a huge demand growth. And they have to manage their supply chain in a completely different fashion as compared to maybe some of the retail stores who are not seeing people at all. They are not seeing any demand, and they have to, close their retail stores. They have to reduce their footprint. They have to look at every ways and means in terms of managing their working capital properly. So I think the actual KPIs themselves is also a dependent of where a company is, which industry it belongs to, and at that point in time, what are some of the key issues they are facing, and what are the kind of metrics as a business, as a company, that they want to achieve over next 3-5 year time frame.
Yes, I really like your analogy about the watermelon effect, because I'm going to remember that not only to think about which are my metrics, also all should be green, because all of us should be pursuing the benefit for the organization overall, right?
Exactly.
So not only looking at our own function. And you brought up a very interesting point about the pandemic and the KPIs that will depend on the supply chain of each organization, where they are, if they are growing or the opposite, right? So is it possible to have an implementation of source to pay or procure to pay in these times? Can we do it remotely, because many businesses are not back in the office?
See, I have a very interesting example and take on this particular question of, can something be done remotely?
Yes.
I really want to take you back. No, I mean, see, in today's world, technology has given us so much of freedom that, world is actually not just flat. It has become like, one time zone, because at this time, I can have team members in India, really doing the work in real time for me. So it doesn't really matter that if it is, midnight or past midnight for them, but it doesn't just matter. But we know today technology has made a lot of things easier, but let's step back and go back a couple of decades and look at the time when Apollo was being launched remotely from Houston, and at that point in time, when we did not have this level of connectivity, when we did not have this level of data storage, right? At that point in time, we could have astronauts hundreds and thousands of miles away, putting their life in the control of somebody, in Houston, like NASA Space Control Center. If something of that nature could be done remotely, and I think this is remotely times power n, because this is not remote like within being US, west coast, east coast, or India and US. That this is not that remote. This is remote like between Earth and somebody being flying hundreds and thousands of kilometers above Earth. So if that could be done remotely, any implementation can be done remotely. That I'm talking about decades ago. Today we have real-time connectivity. Today we have 5G internet. Today we have quantum technologies. We have the kind of communication, instant communication. Our phones are running computers. I mean, with all of that, if as human beings cannot implement something that is not really running a spaceship remotely, then then we have a problem.
Yes, no, that example is great, Rajiv. Great example. And I would like to thank you very much for your explanations. I really enjoy how you use different analogies and comparisons, just like the last one, right, with the Apollo, and now we are, with the technology, we are much more advanced. So, of course, is the time also the pandemic has accelerated, but sometimes I receive that question, right? Can we still do it remotely? And I think, to your point, it helps organizations to become more global and with more resiliency, right? Because
Exactly.
they can continue doing that.
Exactly. I
So,
mean, you have to think about this, Marcia, that, imagine like several decades ago, people had put their lives in the hands of a control which is
yeah.
several 100,000 miles remote,
Yes.
right? Today, remotely, people are getting married. I mean, we are doing things which impact our lives. If that can be done remotely, a source to pay system is a much simpler thing to be done remotely.
Yes. I cannot agree more. So
Right.
thank you so much, Rajiv. It has been a pleasure, and I'm sure the audience is getting great insight from you. Thank you very much for the analogies, your experience, and it was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
I appreciate having me on your show. I really enjoyed the conversation with you, and I really look forward to follow-up conversations, or if any of your users have follow-up questions, happy to answer those. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
You too. Bye bye. Thank you, Rajiv. Thank you very much.